Good afternoon, everyone. So, thank you for joining with us this afternoon. We have Dr. Abdul Azeez Erumban, who is a faculty of the Department of Business and Economics at the University of Groningen, Netherlands, and is basically a productivity measurement specialist who has been working in the area of productivity for more than 2 decades in terms of manufacturing sector and service sector, other sectors productivity, and he has published extensively in the area of industrial economics, to be precise, and he's a faculty in that department for more than 2 decades, and in between for some time he was there with the conference board also for a small period of at least short span of time. And now he's teaching in that Department of Business and Economics. And along with that, he does research basically in the area of industrial economics and other related issues like structural transformation and related issues within the industrial sector, agriculture sector, and service sector also. And today he's going to speak on a very relevant topic for us in terms of industrialization in developing countries, and is it related to poverty reduction? It again is a cross-country study of the developing world with regard to the means asking the historical question of the structural transformation in the new framework, because from the we know about the Fisher and Clerk and Lewis and other hypothesis which we have studied, and he is going back to that with more empirical data and how that industrialization helped in the kind of structural changes in the developing economies, and how far that has been successful in reducing the number of poor, or means uplifting the poor in terms of various indicators, and means I'm not going into the details of that. So thank you, Dr. Azeez, for accepting our invitation and being here. And on behalf of all of you, I welcome you to one of the oldest institute that started actually the poverty estimation in the country. So it's a coincidence that we are talking about poverty in an institute of where we started estimating poverty in India. So thank you for joining with me, and you may take another 30 to 40 minutes, then it will be open for the discussion.
I don't think I would need a mic, right? You can't hear me at the back. Yeah. So first of all, I think Hari has already scared me a little bit that this is the place where poverty measurement started. Yeah. And I'm not an expert in poverty, and this just happened to be something on my table because when my colleague Azeez in degrees is working at the Economic Growth and Development Center, because I do a lot of work on structural change, and we both do a lot of work on that. But this interest in poverty came in on our discussion, and people talk a lot about some sectoral growth and its impact on poverty. So ultimately, as Hari earlier said, the process of economic development entails structural transformation, right? Movement of resources from I don't like to look at it from simple Lewis perspective, but from low productivity sectors to high productivity sectors. Doesn't matter whether it is manufacturing, from agriculture to manufacturing or agricultural services, as what is happening in India. So where workers can gain more income and create more wealth and improve productivity, if that happens, that is something that can bring more prosperity. And that can bring prosperity and growth, which can eventually lead to better direction in forward. So that idea we came to our mind, and then we decided to explore this using the data. So first of all, thank you for inviting me here, very particular, and all of you for being here today, despite the fact that I just heard from Honorable VC that it's a break, the semester break actually got here. So despite that, for being here to listen to me. And I appreciate any questions or comments. If you have clarifications, of course, you may raise your hand while I go over, and I will try to be as brief as possible. So this is a paper which I did with Section Degrees for the United Nations University in Leiden, because it's also an offspring of a project called Economic Transformation Database. So this is a database where we have about more than 50 countries in which we provide employment and output data by state sectors. Like, I think 5 or 6 core sectors in the economy, including a lot of African countries and Asian countries. So the question we raise here is that industrialization in developing countries is related to poverty reduction. So what motivates this is basically there has been some recent evidence that manufacturing sector has been showing some renaissance in some of the African countries. So there's a paper by Hagen Cruz, Emmanuel Manesh, and Kunal, maybe many of you know Kunal because he is the director of the Wider, and my colleague Francis Rees, which shows some data that the employment share in manufacturing has been improving recently in some of the African countries. What kind of employment it is, that's a big question, whether it is in the formal sector or informal sector, that I'm not going into that. And most of it is happening, for example, Roderick and others have been arguing that it has been happening in small scale manufacturing sector in these countries. Most recently, in India, I mean, since I'm talking to you, but as I said rightly, this paper is not about India, but it is about more of a kind of a cross-country match. So most recently, Golda has written, since I'm speaking to you, I mean, India, there has been a lot of debate that employment has been stagnant in the manufacturing sector. It has been staying around 11% throughout, especially the formal manufacturing employment has been declining and so on. But Gokhale in 2023 says that there has been robust employment growth in 2023. And also, even after that, there has been a continued shift to formal sector jobs from informal sector jobs. And I don't ask me questions about that particularly because I don't know more about it. But I did hear it from, actually I came to Mumbai to attend the World Asia Conference organized by the RBA. And I just heard this from him yesterday at the conference. So, but we also know that, I mean, many of you know better than me, when the Ministry of Statistics in India shifted from the traditional employment and employment survey to EFLFS. Recently, there has been a huge hike in employment numbers. I mean, and we don't see a corresponding increase in GDP and output, but there is this employment. Whether it is true or not, that is something which is still to be validated. But I'm not going to the details of that. But so there is a kind of so this was also in the media. For example, this chart is from Economist. So there is a kind of feeling that the manufacturing renaissance has been happening, even though at low level. So traditionally, the idea is that manufacturing, the structural transformation or the workers' movement from low productivity to high productivity sectors, as I said, does not matter whether it is from agriculture to manufacturing, which is what the Lewis and others have originally hypothesized. But then later literature really moved on to incorporate more sectors. For example, if you have 20 sectors, you can really look into whether it is happening across these 20 sectors to more productive sectors or not. So to put it in simple words, from traditional to modern, more productive sectors that can improve living standards of people. Danny Roderick would call this growth enhancing structural change. So there are 2 types of structural change he would look at it. Growth reducing structural change, because jobs are moving to sectors which are not productive. For example, this has been partly the case in India, because a lot of the shift from agricultural jobs is not going to manufacturing in India, but it is going to construction sector significantly. But of course, the good thing is that construction sector still offers relatively higher wages than the agriculture sector. Now, the question is that why this structural change would be related to poverty reduction. So this has to do with how economic growth influences poverty, right? Because economic growth traditionally has seen to have an influence on reduce poverty, provided the benefits of economic growth is distributed among people, right? Because most people in the society benefits from the fruits of economic growth. If that is the situation, economic growth can reduce poverty. But on aggregate, the assumption we are making is that, assuming that inequality does not get worse, so an overall rise in the income of the people, or the rise in the economic growth, can help reduce poverty. It can have a lot of trickle-down effects also, because even on the inequality side, it can have trickle-down effects. It can improve human capital, for example, because that will help education, access to education for more people. And more importantly, it can also improve the ability of governments to support poverty alleviation programs and so on. So overall, economic growth can have many ways it can have help poverty reduction. Now, in this process of structural economic growth, structural change is very important. And now let me tell you the way in which I look at structural change in this paper is basically whether workers are moving to more productive sectors and sectors where productivity is growing faster. Now, why that would be the case and why that can have an influence on poverty reduction? First of all, productivity differs substantially across sectors. Some sectors are more productive. Their output per worker, for example, if you define productivity as output per worker, it differs substantially across sectors. Some sectors have higher productivity while others do not have. And that would implicitly mean that the real wages in some sectors can be higher than others. So if workers are moving more and more to sectors where productivity is higher, that can have an influence on the real wages in the economy, which can help reduce poverty. And the other thing is that if you improve productivity in one sector, where that can also create income and increase the income, real income of workers in that sector, and it can also create spillover effect on other sectors, because it can create more demand for output from other sectors, which can eventually lead to kind of growing wages in other sectors. Now, so here I am really making a very heroic assumption that poor people who are working in some sectors are can easily move to other sectors, right? Because they have the qualification, education, they have the ability, and they have the opportunity to do that, which may not be true. So that is an assumption which we are making here, but it may not be true in reality. There will be a lot of barriers for poor people to move into other sectors. I'm sorry. Now, so this is not the first time somebody is looking into how industrialization influences what is direction. There is research on that, but most of these studies look into the sector model, right? Agriculture versus non-agriculture. The implied assumption in those models is that agriculture employs most of the poor people, and once they move to non-agriculture sector, their standard of living improves, and then they look into how they basically do a kind of regression on how the growth rate in agricultural sector influence poverty. This is called the growth elasticity of poverty, right? So they're looking. So there is important papers like the third level in 1998, which is very important papers in this field. There are also a few other papers which looks into multiple sectors, like including agriculture services and manufacturing, for example. But again, they do not look into how the change in the workers' share in different sectors influence, or the shift from one sector to other sector influence poverty reduction. They basically again look into whether the growth rate of output or per capita income in one sector has a direct impact on capital production. So in this paper, what we do is that we propose and implement an empirical framework which looks into the impact of structural change on poverty reduction. What will we find? So in case I don't get time to at the end, is basically structural change is related to poverty reduction. Basically means that taking all the assumptions in hand, workers moving to more productive sectors does have an important implication for poverty reduction. And then productivity growth in the manufacturing sector specifically has an important positive impact on poverty reduction, but that effect is mostly confined to developing Asian economies. So, which includes China, for example, so and also some of the other Asian economies. While sub-Saharan African countries do not see the magnitude of that effect visible. No. So that impact is not visible in sub-Saharan African countries where the manufacturing productivity has not been growing enough. So this is again, I don't know what is the type of work which you do, because in poverty-related literature, a lot of people work on micro household kind of data. This is totally outside that. This is a very macro industry broad perspective, looking at from the structural change perspective. So this second conclusion which I have here is basically coming from a kind of attribution exercise which we do after estimating the model and understanding the coefficients for the impact of structural change and manufacturing productivity and poverty, and looking into the actual data in developing nations such as Africa to see how much impact actually. Now, let me show you the framework here, what I have here. So on the top right side, you have three different types of effects, which I call the sectoral productivity effect, and the labor force participation effect, structural change effect. And I'm going to explain to you how I am seeing these three effects here. So first of all, the improvements in the productivity in any given sector, for example, manufacturing, which reduce poverty by raising real wages, as I explained earlier, and income of the workers, right? So this effect, we call it is a kind of function of productivity, direct productivity effect, or the sectoral productivity effect. Again, this is coming from a study by Christians and others in 2011. Then, in this case, there are 3 points I wanted to highlight actually how the productivity effect can work. It can work in 3 ways. The first is the location of the poor. So, in which sector the most poor people are working, whether they are working in agriculture sector or whether they are working in manufacturing sector or other sector. If productivity improves in those sectors, that can have this direct impact on poverty reduction. So the second thing is that the labor intensity of the sector. I mean, how much in aggregate? I mean, it's not only the workforce is working, but how much in aggregate workers are engaged in a particular sector, right? For example, if the telecommunications sector, which is very capital intensive, for example, is increasing its productivity, its direct impact on poverty reduction that other sectors. And finally, the distribution of assets among workers and across sectors in this. Now we have at the bottom and the middle side, we have the labor force participation effect and the structural change of effect actually. So labor force participation in the aggregate economy is workers' participation is increasing. That can have an income effect, which can eventually lead to productivity and poverty reduction effect. Finally, it's the most important thing which we are looking into, the structural change effect. So structural change effect is basically how much this movement of workers can lead to productivity improvement. So how workers, there are 2 opposing effects here. One is a positive effect, as I said earlier. So this one workers reallocation across sectors of different productivity levels, which can create more productivity and wages. But again, the diminished to reallocation that can offset that impact, so that can reduce that impact. So that is how this framework works. So this all lead to production growth and finally poverty reduction. So this is the framework which we are using, and to understand the reallocation part of this. So in the previous slide, we have this sectoral productivity effect, which is like how much productivity growth is growing in any given sector. And the second part is the labor force participation rate, which we know, right? I mean, we can easily calculate. But then the third component is the structural change component, because it is how do we calculate that. So this is a decomposition exercise which we do here. So where per capita income, which is the left-hand side here, which we regress on within sector productivity. So which is nothing but the labor productivity. YCI is the labor productivity in country R and country C actually here, and weighted by the share of employment in any sector. So in sector I, in particular country C, what is the labor productivity in agriculture, for example, and it is being weighted by the share of agriculture sector in that country's total employment, and so that we call it as worker within sector productivity. So nothing but the productivity growth of a sector weighted by the size of that sector in the economy's total employment. So that is the contribution of that sector to aggregate productivity growth. And then we have a worker reallocation term. The worker reallocation term is calculated as the how much of labor workers is actually moving across sectors and how much of that is being contributed to aggregate labor productivity. So this is a simple equation developed by Styro in 2002 article, where if you take the difference between aggregate labor productivity calculated as the sum of all the output in the economy across sectors and the sum of all the employment across the sectors, and calculate the growth rate, and take the difference with that of that from the weighted labor productivity growth rate of each industry by weighting with their value added share. So that component is the worker reallocation effect, and then the labor participation effect, which is nothing but the employment to total population rate, and then finally we also include some control variables. The control variables includes inequality because there are important papers which, as I said earlier, the distribution of income is an important factor in determining the impact of growth on poverty reduction. And then we have some regional dummies for sub-Saharan Africa and development, and we also calculate this for separate effective individual sectors, like for example manufacturing sectors and so on, by looking into the question here. Now, so what is the data which we use? This is standard data, poverty data from World Bank's Net. So we use the $1.90 purchasing for country headcount ratio here. So this data is not available for every year. So we take a poverty spells, and by doing that, the poverty estimates over time in the World Bank estimates is not comparable over time in many cases. So there is a paper by Atmanov and et al. From the World Bank in 2019, which gives you a list of most comparable poverty spells in the World Bank. So we take a spell of minimum of 4 years. For example, in India, for example, if you have 2000 data, then we try to at least get 2004 as the second spell. The reason why we take at least 4 years is because the structural change impact needs to have some sort of adjustment time to have any major meaningful impact. So we had 119 spells for observations from 42 countries, including 17 African countries over the period 1990. So the inequality is a control variable which is measured by the standard measure of Gini coefficient from United Nations, and then the sectoral data on employment and unemployment, sorry, output is taken from the economic database. Now let me straight go to the results here. So here the dependent variable is the change in poverty rate, 1.90 headcount ratio, and log of per capita GDP, which is here the first variable. Then the aggregate labor productivity. So I'm coming to each of these models: labor force participation, Gini coefficients, and the dummy variable, dummy developing Asia and constant. So the first model, model 1, does not have any of the interesting variables which we are interested in. Would be basically looking to the dummy of sub-Saharan Africa and dummy of developing Asia compared to the other parts of the world. So what we see is that in both these regions, poverty has definitely declined compared to the rest of the world. And you see that the decline in poverty has been more intense and significant in developing Asia.
What is the rest of the world here? Which are the countries?
Developing countries. So it's about another
Rest of the developing countries.
Yes, there is no advanced economy of this. So Yeah, so that's about, so you see that the impact is, the difference between Africa and Asia is substantial here, that you see that the decline in poverty has been significant. Now we first include the growth, is semi-include elasticity of GDP per capita growth, so GDP per capita growth here, and you can see that the impact is positive, 0.176, it is significant and positive, negative, so which basically means that economic growth, per capita income growth, in this sample has a significant negative impact on poverty, or there is a poverty reducing effect on by per capita income growth. And the developing Asia dummy still remains significant, while Sub-Saharan Africa is not. Now, in the third regression, we include Gini coefficient, which is a control variable. So we again see that the poverty is, so the per capita income coefficient does not change, almost it remains the same. But then the Gini coefficient is positive, which is as expected, because higher inequality leads to higher poverty, lower poverty pressure. And then in the final model, which is the most interesting model here, we decompose this per capita GDP growth using this equation. So the per capita GDP growth is decomposed into three components here. So the aggregate labor productivity in the economy, which is the first component, and then the labor force participation. So this is a perfect identity, because the aggregate labor productivity growth can be decomposed into labor force participation. Sorry, GDP per capita can be decomposed into aggregate labor productivity and labor force participation. So what you see here is that the aggregate labor productivity growth has a negative impact, significant impact. Labor force participation is negative, but it is not significantly influencing poverty reduction. Gini coefficient still remains the same, and the dummy variable for Asia. Now, Africa is also somewhat significant, but it has lost its significance slightly. Now, the chain dependent variable, but now what we are doing is that we are going to include this reallocation effects or the structural change effect into the model. The first is that the labor productivity within sector. So which is within productivity improvement effect. Both of them have significant effect, negative effect. But you see the labor productivity due to reallocation, which is the structural change effect, which is also significant here. And it's not as big as the impact of, so it's actually, I'm sorry, it's even bigger than the impact of productivity growth within the sector. So workers' movement to sectors where productivity levels are higher does have a larger impact on reducing poverty in these countries. Now then we also have this interaction dummy due to the allocation in the Sub-Saharan Africa and developing Asia, which basically says that we don't see much differences here. The Gini coefficient still remains the same. Labor force participation also remains the same. It does not have much back. And we also have a joint test for reallocation effect of developing Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, which also shows joint effect of this. These are also significant actually. So overall, what it basically says that the impact of reallocation or structural change on poverty reduction is significant both in this sample of countries. And here, so what we basically do is that we look into agriculture and manufacturing sectors and some other sectors separately. Instead of looking at the structural change as such, we look into productivity growth in these sectors, and you see that manufacturing sector has a significant impact. Agriculture sector does not. So you're surprised that it has a significant, it is negative, but it is not very significant. And interestingly, trade and transport sector has a positive impact on on poverty reduction. So which basically means that this productivity growth in trade and transport services sector does not have a significant poverty reducing effect. If at all any, it's actually increasing poverty, while most of it is coming from manufacturing sector. And the relocation sector again still remains the same. Actually, it is negative here in this model. And the joint effect is also significant. So here we have the interaction terms here, and joint effect is also significant. So productivity within individual sectors and the structural change when you put together, and the productivity within sector productivity growth, if you separate into individual sectors, what we see is that most of that within industry productivity component is coming from manufacturing sector. Now we do, so the conclusion so far we have is that the structural change has an impact, negative impact on poverty. So is the case with aggregate within sector productivity growth, but that is coming primarily from manufacturing sector and not from other sectors. And now what we do is that we use these coefficients to do a kind of attribution exercise to see which region and which of the sectoral productivity is contributing more to reduction in poverty. So here basically it's something, it's basically we are using the estimated coefficient with the actual data on productivity. So, and you can see that the purple line here, which is the productivity due to reallocation or the structural change, it is substantially high in developing Asia, but it is also high in sub-Saharan Africa, while in other developing countries it is still negative, but it is not very significantly large. But the orange one here, which is the manufacturing sector, which seems to have a negative impact on poverty reduction, and positive impact on poverty reduction, primarily in the developing Asian economies, while we don't see anything similar to that in Southern Africa, but they also have some impact on other developing Asian economies. Other developing countries. So in Africa, agriculture and reallocation effect are the most dominant one, while in developing Asia, manufacturing and reallocation are the most important factors that are used only. So, yeah, I think I'm going to skip that slide, but basically what we did here in this paper is to propose a framework to understand the impact of structural change. We have an equation which we use to estimate the structural change in the paper, and how industrialization is actually backed using its coefficient, actually impacting poverty reduction in Asia, Africa. And what we find is that structural change does have a significant impact on poverty reduction, and industrialization in developing countries will have, but that is primarily happening in African countries, sorry, in Asian countries, but not in Africa. So, which basically implies the importance of focusing on more productivity growth and in African manufacturing, and also policies to encourage worker movement, for example, upskilling the population to more productive sectors of the economy. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
So I would like to begin. So I wanted to understand the variable construction. If we can pull up the slide. So yeah. So especially about how we are constructing the manufacturing variable. Is it share in the total value added or employment or how? I mean,
so you're asking about this one, the theta.
So when we are attributing the poverty reduction to manufacturing, what does that manufacturing really mean?
So in that equation where I look at the manufacturing productivity per se, that is the productivity of manufacturing sector and aggregate manufacturing sector weighted by its value added share in the total economy. And we also tried it with employment share, which the research remains the same. And even the reallocation effect, even because of Fabricam in 1942 and the Kuznets kind of approach would use the so-called chip share analysis, which is employment share, the results are pretty the same.
Yeah, so that means the results are very robust.
Yeah.
And that means that sector, manufacturing sector, has potentially, a stronger role to play in poverty reduction, and also in from the point of view of inequality. Because if the results are so robust, that means, and the inequality is reducing, that means the poverty is reducing, that means inequality is not being driven by manufacturing. Otherwise, the poverty effects would happen. So, in that case, have you seen how manufacturing interacts with inequality? No, it's not. Or maybe you can suggest something.
Honestly speaking, I didn't think about that, and we didn't think that. So you're saying is that, so from this conclusion, given the fact that manufacturing productivity comes out to be very high and inequality still remains significant. So the role of inequality is the manufacturing sector in influencing inequality maybe. So how does that figure out in this story, right? So I think honestly speaking, I haven't thought about it.
Because I have been thinking about this, and of course the data is not cross-country in India, and I was looking in this relationship, and I found that the relationship between inequality and manufacturing is good for poverty. That is, the manufacturing reduces inequality. So that is good. I mean, the intermediate channel we can think of as a thing. And the other thing I wanted to ask you is, because this is at the global level.
By the way, let me tell you one thing actually. One of the reviewer comments which we got on this paper is to remove inequality from the system.
Yeah.
Because the reviewer says that poverty and inequality are cross-feeding each other in a way, right? So because of that, you should also estimate this model excluding inequality. We did that. I don't have the slides yet, but nothing changes.
Yeah, and the other thing I wanted to understand about at the theoretical level. So we would also, Professor Karnaik asked you about the models, dual economic models especially. So how do you see at the theoretical level these results can fit in? So for example, there might be multiple processes going on in this process of structural transformation. So we can explain it from the dual economic models, whose next process, or Lewis model, or then migration had to have a model or something. So have you? I mean, I would like to hear from you how you try to see these results in the theoretical way.
Yeah, it's a difficult question. First of all, second thing is that if you confine this to the two-sector model, which I generally don't, which is far away from reality, right? And then form any kind of theoretical discussion, it's never going to be clear, right? So from the Lewis kind of model perspective, the idea is that if you take all your workers, I mean most of your workers from farm to factory, for example, right? I mean the services came in the later models, farm to factory. So that is going to create a lot of higher productivity, improvement in the wages and productivity in the agricultural sector, because the marginal productivity of those workers who are coming out of that sector is nearly zero or even negative, because they were contributing to it. And then it is going to increase the productivity of the manufacturing sector also, so that is effectively going to have an overall impact on the agriculture. So that is also going to reduce your inequality and poverty. So that would be the kind of dynamics that is happening. But more than that, I don't have much to say.
Thank you very much. Very interesting presentation. And you made what you wanted to do, and your assumptions you made it very clear. My question is that you are also showing that trade and transport has no impact on poverty. You are also showing that business and financial sector has no impact on poverty. So this is how I would like to look at mobility transition. Mobility transition both in terms of sector and also spatial, what Balu was telling you, Todaro's model or whatever the mobility, spatial mobility. So these two categories, particularly the trade and transportation and business and financial, these are not showing because people are there who are above poverty. So when somebody that is a large mass of people above poverty line, then of course that reduction is not possible. This is statistical fallacy. Statistical fallacy. This has also an impact on inequality. it is also showing that people, those who are in trade and transport and financial and business sector, their income productivity is rising so much high that it has no negative impact on the inequality. So inequality is very, very important. How the reviewer has listed you. I think you should reflect on
No, the
reviewers comment also.
We did not exclude, we did not agree with the reviewer, but rather we added another regression research to satisfy the reviewer's appetite, that showing that, okay, even if you exclude it from the regression, it's not going to change it.
Thank you.
So that's all it is.
Thank you very much. Would I see this third last slide where you have third and fourth list? There is a chart of African countries and
Oh, this one.
yeah, this one. This developing Asia for agriculture, you have it on that side. What does it mean even for sub-Saharan? If you could explain the agriculture.
So agriculture basically means that agriculture is actually contributing to reduce poverty. Agriculture production.
Sorry,
No, it's actually market services. If you're
no,
So
the positive side of it.
I'm sorry, saying on this side.
Yeah, right.
Green things.
this one,
Then
right?
you have minus, yeah.
That,
You
this
have
one.
-1, -2 there. No, on that side.
This one.
About the positive one.
Oh, this one. This one. That is the market service.
And then what does it mean if it is -1, -2?
This is positive. Actually.
That increases poverty.
That increases poverty.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that basically means that improvement in productivity in the market services actually increasing poverty. It's the contribution was not significant, but in terms of volume, what if you look at attributions, it does not actually help reduce poverty. Maybe some of it may be a level effect, as we said already, because if these sectors is already having higher productivity level, it's marginal impact in reducing poverty. Unless provided the fact that we are not capturing the spillover effects in this, right? We are only capturing the direct. So that may be the fact.
What does market services include actually?
Market services include trade, transportation.
Matches with
Yeah. So it's like services which are not like public administration, health, education. Also, I think if I remember correctly, we also excluded real estate from it. if I remember correctly.
So there is evidence on this also. Market services, as you have defined.
Yeah.
They increase inequality a lot.
Yeah. Okay. So do you have
So
a
that is
reference?
the challenge. So in India, for example, came Asia Development Bank. He is at the Asian Development Bank. He has worked on.
Is there a paper?
Yeah.
I highly appreciate that. Thank you. Yeah. I hope I answered your question, madam. Right? Yeah.
Thank you so much, sir, for the presentation. I just had one query related to the topic. Related to the topic.
Okay.
The data set which we are using, that is nearly 20 years, right? 28 years. We have different kind of economic distortions in between this. For example, the financial crisis. Does it capture like in this years, the industrial output also fluctuates, right? So does it this model captures those economic fluctuations and the distortions?
Yeah, so the fluctuation part, I'm not worried a lot because I'm taking 4-year window in this. So it's like average out to the rate. So that's not going to be reflected a lot. We look into that. How much standard deviation, for example, is there? It's not problematic. But this policy changes, for example, I mean, every country may have its own policy differences, but given the sample size, we don't have a fixed effect in this model. So that is something I completely agree with you. It's a limitation of this paper because we cannot capture it. So 56 countries definitely will have 56 policy regimes. So it's too much to.
Because like when there is a fluctuation in the industrial output, certainly it would have impact on the power used. Right. So there will be a relationship, certainly.
Yeah. So I think my intuition would be that some of those fluctuations, cyclical fluctuations we're talking about, right? I mean, business cycles and other cyclical fluctuations, that will be averaged out when you are taking this 4-year window. Some of it. So It's not going to be substantially affecting our business. That's fine. And we also try to run this regression excluding China, for example. The Chinese are biased is working for the business standards.
Additionally, you are taking productivity rates.
Yeah.
So the compared to the levels.
Yeah, it's not levels. Yeah, that's true. That's another point actually. It's growth rates, productivity growth. So it's not just the output growth rate. Output growth rate is the output divided by employment. Growth rate is output divided.
Thank you.
Thank you for that reminder.
Yes, sir. It is.
Just a couple of observations, if I may. Thank you for a very lucid kind of presentation. What I find particularly interesting is that you have basically a microeconomic approach, but you have a macro perspective. Now, to me, methodologically, that is always a problem, but I'm not getting into that. Whenever you do cross-country thing, you are ironing over all institutional changes, etc., and all the differences in levels. And statistically, you can treat them by taking differences, etc. I'm aware of that. But that's one observation that I had. The second is, again, an observation. I don't think inequality and poverty should be there. So I would be more inclined to let it reverse thing. Because purely logically and arithmetically, it is completely possible to have increasing inequality and with reduction in poverty. There is just no two ways about it. And there are no clear stories we can tell that are plausible that will feed into the other, except a very microeconomic thing where you say that there is this man who was poor, who now gets employed in industrial thing. So naturally, then it's a no-brainer. I mean, then he goes to a higher productivity sector, his poverty goes down, and so on. And inequality as a consequence decreases. But if you look at it from a macro perspective, that's not the case. Therefore, that's another observation. The question I have is, have you, for example, looked at discounting or doing something about the fact of government's interventions? For example, if you have growth, you have tax dividend, you then use the tax dividend for social policy, which reduces poverty reduction. Now, whether it is industry, whether it is services, whether it's whatever else, if the government sensibly does that, and that is the whole argument of all pro-growth people. So have you done something to discount for that in your analysis is the question.
I'll start with the question actually. There is a paper by Aratna Agarwal, maybe you know about that paper. So where she tries to understand the decline in productivity by looking into how government expenditure on social sector development influences that. So we started with that actually, that idea and extending, including that into this paper. We did that, and did not, once we have all these variables in the model, it does not come out to be very important. And then we sent this paper and we presented this paper in a World Bank conference in Africa. Yeah, a sea of microeconomics papers, and I was the only one presenting this macro papers. With a lot of work concern because poverty is looked at from a micro perspective, everyone. But then people were also saying that, okay, in this kind of regression, it is not necessary to include that because your objective is so very different. So that's why we eventually excluded it. But I can tell you that it is not going, it's not changing anything. Now about your observations. Did I forget actually? What was the first observation? Okay. Yeah. Yeah, but yeah, your second observation about Gini equilibrium, right? I fully agree with you partially in the sense that Gini at the lower tail of the Gini distribution is poor people are. So by definition, this poverty is part of. So that may be the reason why, one would think that it should not be part of it. But on the other hand, there is this whole set of papers which would argue that the impact of economic growth on poverty reduction should be moderated by some sort of art accounting for the inequality of the distribution component of it. Because even if economic growth increases, and if it is concentrated in some form of the economy and some people, segment of the population, it's not going to increase. So you account for that. That is the idea behind it. But I agree that there is a kind of, I mean, I don't know the right answer. That it is. Earlier, I was saying,
Why I got that confused. I sometimes worry that we might go back if you push the inequality when you're talking of poverty. We might go back to active growth, which I think will be a problem. So that's why I'm worried about it. Otherwise, there is no.
Yeah, but I to that actually, I mean, our results holds regardless of the include or exclude Gini coefficient in the equation. And we have an appendix to that. Thank you very much for this.
Thank you, Azeez, for an elaborate discussion on the important issue of which India is possibly looking forward in the time, because we always had a missing middle problem, which Kunalson has been continuously writing on the missing middle in terms of manufacturing, and he has been continuously writing for 2 decades about the missing productivity also growth in the manufacturing sector. So these two are going to be very crucial for the coming years in India with regard to, means it's not only the structural change that matters, it's again the structural change along with the movement to the high productive sectors or sub-sectors which matters in terms of welfare improvement when it comes to the poverty reduction or means improvement in terms of other dimensions of capability also. Because we are moving away, means moving ahead from that of the simple estimates of the headcount and other poverty. And when it comes to the other dimensions of poverty also, these larger multi-dimensional poverty also, these issues still remains relevant. That is what I feel, that these questions still remains valid because this kind of structural change and the related productivity growth can only push the developing countries like India to the levels which we are trying for in terms of a kind of a convergence, at least in the, or means from a larger time point of view, if we have to catch up with that of the Western world, this is the way which we have to think of improving the productivity as well as making the people ready for movement in terms of improving their capability. That also to a great extent matters in terms of, because we have to be making ourselves prepared for that kind of a change, which we have seen from some of our neighboring countries in the near East Asian countries. They have done a marvelous job in terms, including China, in terms of transforming their workplace from that of the traditional to that of the modern sector. So this question still remains after even 100 years of development economies, and I feel that this will continue to bother development economies for some more time, when the economies will move to a higher level of or higher standard of living. So thank you, Dr. Azeez, once again for initiating such a discussion. I'm sure that some of the younger minds here, they definitely be taking this issue forward in terms of further research in this area. So thank you for your time. So we are perfectly 1 hour. So
Thank you very much.
Thank you.